Hello, Hub City kids, and welcome to 2021. I hope you're all doing well and that you had a fantastic Christmas, even though things were a little bit different this year. I hope you relaxed and remembered all of the good things that happened last year, even though there were some bad things too. But there's always bad things and good things mixed in together. I am pretty excited about today because we are starting a new book of the Bible. We are going through the book of Exodus starting today, and we'll be going through it all the way up till Easter. I'm doubly excited about this book because I've been wanting to do this for almost 6 years. I love the book of Exodus, and it's kind of a foundation of the whole Bible. It's only the second book in the Bible. We have Genesis and then we have Exodus. So much happens in this story, and there's a lot of just really good little stories in there that I'm super excited to go through. So we're also doing it a little bit differently this year, this book, because normally we go through the whole book and we read all of the chapters and we do it together and we kind of go through it really, really well. We're not doing that with the book of Exodus because it is so full of stuff. And it took us 3 years to get through the book of John, and we don't want to take another 3 years to go through the book of Exodus. So we're going to go through it a lot faster than that, which means that we're not going to get to read through it together the same way that we normally do. So I'm going to challenge and encourage all of you to read the book of Exodus together as a family. And hopefully you do this anyway with the other books, but it's a little bit different. So next week, for instance, you should read books 1 and 2 and talk about that as a family and read through it together so that you'll be ready for next week. This book, Exodus, being after Genesis, means that there's only one other book for you to know anything about before you get to Exodus. So I want you as a family now to open up your book, your Bible, and flip through the book of Genesis and see what you remember. And if you flip through it and you can read the headings and see, maybe let it trigger your memory of some other things. We've recently gone through some pretty major things in Genesis, so hopefully it's fresh in your mind. And while you're pausing the video, I want you to think through and summarize the whole book of Genesis. Hopefully it won't take you too long. But remember, it's in the Old Testament, which means that Jesus hasn't been born yet. And the New Testament is when Jesus has been born. Does that mean Jesus is not in the story at all? Nope, because Jesus was there at the very, very beginning of creation, which was in Genesis, but he's not fully man yet, as well as fully God. So pause the video, and yes, I will make a crazy face, and while the video's paused, you're thinking through highlights of Genesis and summarizing that as a family. Ready? Was I out of practice, or was that good? Okay, so we have creation and the fall. God creates the whole world, and he tells Adam and Eve that they can do anything they want except for one thing. And what do? They do that one thing. And so God tells them, I'm so sorry, because you did this thing, you cannot be with me in the garden anymore. And does he say, I'd never want to see you again, you have to leave the garden, and you're terrible, and I regret ever making you? He doesn't. He clothes them, and he is so sad that they can't be with him anymore, but he still is with them. And he makes Adam a promise. He makes Adam and Eve a promise. And this promise is that he still loves them and that he will destroy the snake that tricked them. This first promise is, remember we talked about a promise is also called a covenant. This first covenant is called an Adamic covenant. Can you say that? Adamic covenant. And that just means a promise that God made to Adam. So after that, what happens? God's people did a bunch of really, really terrible things. They're no longer in the garden, and God is so sad that they're not listening to him, but there's one family that does remember God, Noah. And so then what happens? There's the flood and Noah's family and all of that. And at the very end of all of that, God sends a rainbow. And what is that rainbow? It's a promise. Do you know what the promise is for? The promise is that God will never again send a flood to destroy the whole world. So this covenant is called the Noahic covenant because he made a promise to Noah. Can you say that one? Noahic covenant. That one's my favorite one to say. I like the way Noahic sounds. So then what happens? This one we just recently talked about. There's Abraham. And Abraham, remember the blood path, and God makes a promise to Abraham that what? His descendants, his children, his family, will be as numerous as the stars. And God does the blood path, and this promise also tells Abraham that Abraham's gonna fail, right? But God makes the covenant with Abraham, but bears the full responsibility of keeping the covenant and the consequences for breaking the covenant. That's going to be an important part of this. So can you imagine what that covenant was called? The Abrahamic covenant. Can you say that? It's just Abraham with an IC at the end. Covenant. So this is wrapping up the book of Genesis, and we get to the story of Joseph, which we talked about this summer. And Joseph gets sold into slavery by his family, and a bunch of really terrible things happen to him, and then God saves him, and then more terrible things happen to him. But the important thing about the story of Joseph is that Joseph never forgets God in that whole thing. He has doubts, and he gets scared, and he's sad, but he always remembers God, even when the good things happen, which is sometimes the hardest. Sometimes it's really easy to remember and to call for God when things are going really, really hard. But Joseph remembers who God is, even when the good things are happening. So Joseph ends up being one of the most important leaders in Egypt. And he brings his family, because there's a famine and a drought, and he brings his whole family to Egypt in order to keep them safe and to keep them fed. So lots and lots and lots of years later, his family is still in Egypt, except now they are slaves. Do you know what a slave is? If you do, you can talk about it with your family. But a slave is somebody, it's kind of like a servant, except they don't get paid. And it's way worse than being a servant because they have no choices. It's kind of like, slaves were even thought of kind of like animals because you could buy and you could sell a slave. The slaves had no freedoms and no choices, and they had to work when they were told to work, and they got separated from their families. And it was a really, really sad and hard time for God's people. And they were stuck in Egypt. And that is how the book of Exodus starts, where all of God's people are slaves in a foreign land, and they're not happy about it. But we have a clue about what's going to happen because the book is called Exodus. Exodus means a large group of people moving from one place to the next. So we have a pretty good idea when we start this book that God's people probably won't be in Egypt for very long, which if you can think of the stories that you know of Exodus, you know that is true. They won't stay there for very long, but they have a lot of stuff that has to happen before they get to leave. So we're going to be talking about that book of Exodus, but I just have a question. Why do you think it was important for me to tell you and talk through all of these other things that happened in Genesis? Why do you think it's important to know these different covenants throughout the Bible? And this isn't the end. There's more covenants coming. The Bible is a whole big story, And there's lots and lots of little stories in there. And we talk about all those lots of little stories. And those lots of little stories are so important and they're so good. And we can learn so much about God and who He is from those little stories. But if you only know those little stories, you're missing a whole huge part of God's plan, because God's rescue plan is so much bigger than those little stories. They start from creation and that Adamic covenant and go all the way to Jesus. And it's really important for us to know that whole big story is part, and those little stories are part of the big, huge story. So that's why we keep that in mind and why we want to know what happened before Exodus, so we know the promises that God made and that He keeps those promises. And it helps to have names for those promises, so that when we're thinking, in Joseph, was that after what covenant? And it gives you kind of a way to organize all of those stories, because all of these covenants that God makes, it doesn't mean that He no longer is keeping the Adamic covenant when He makes the Noahic covenant. All of these promises build on each other and they get better and bigger and more specific. And so it's important for us to remember where, in the context of where those things are happening, because it helps us understand the stories better. So that's why, and that's all of the information that you need to know so that you can understand the book of Exodus before we go into it. There's a lot more information. So this week, I would love for you as a family to read chapters 1 and 2 of Exodus before next week. And if you have some time and you want to, it's also really good if you go on YouTube and look up the Bible Project. They have 2 videos. They're about 12 minutes long total for the first part of Exodus and the second part of Exodus. And it's helpful to understand what we're going into and the whole big picture of Exodus before we get through the little stories, because it helps us understand, to know where we came from and where we're going. I hope you all had a fantastic week, and I can't wait to see on video you next week, and or those of you that will come to church in person, to see all of you. I love you, Hub City kids, and I hope to see you all soon.